All right, looks like we're live. I'm here with Dr. Doug Hamp. If you are familiar with my channel, which is still new and growing, you probably are already familiar with my guest today, as he's been at this a lot longer than I have. But the interesting thing was, if you've seen a little bit of my background, you know that I was introduced to Torah and keeping the Torah and just everything what it meant about 10 years ago. And then I went off to Bible college and essentially convinced to stop keeping Torah. So I went away for many years, and a little over a year ago, because my wife had been keeping Torah, we jumped full-fledged in. I left the church that I was a board member of, Sunday school teacher of, and am now facilitating a fellowship. But the interesting thing, as far as you, I didn't know who you were until recently, but I was actually just the other day looking back because I searched your name in like a Facebook Messenger or something, and the people that introduced me to Torah 10 years ago, they sent me a video that I watched of you 9 or 10 years ago, and I completely forgot that you were in it. It was a video of you and Rob Skiba.
Okay.
I think you guys were talking about Revelation 6, and there was a reference to Kung Fu Panda.
Quest for Truth is what we were doing.
Yes.
Kung Fu Panda. That's I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But yeah, today, basically what I wanted to get into, whenever you're new to Torah, the first thing you want to do, and whenever you search, whether it be through the scripture or other Torah teachers, you see stuff about dietary laws or your identity or Zitzit or other things. But to me, there's something that I've been dealing with this past year, and I know other people are dealing with, and I just haven't seen a lot of video material on, and that is just opposition, especially if like you're me and you've left the Sunday church. I know some people that have continued to go to church on Sunday and keep Saturday Sabbath, but you tend to get opposition from fellow church members and even family members, and I'll be honest with you, it can be quite hurtful at times. And so I just wanted to go through Matthew 10, and that's what we're going to do today. And to me, I feel like it has a lot of good speaking points from Yeshua on how to handle certain situations. Does that sound all right with you?
Sounds great. Yeah.
Yep. So just as a refresher, the end of Matthew 9, we see they're going into the kingdom, healing people, and Matthew 10 actually starts out where he's calling the disciples, and it tells them to heal people of every disease and sickness. And the bulk of this will get into verse 7, but my first question is actually starting in verse 5 and 6 for you.
Okay.
And so I don't know how much it's on the topic I was wanting to get to, but it's there in chapter 10, so I'm going to ask the question. Yeah. But it says, "These 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, 'Do not go the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.'"
Yeah.
Now, whenever I was, Jim Staley has a really good video on identity crisis and learning who the lost sheep are, who the northern tribes are, and he comes to the lost sheep. But when the northern tribe was dispersed, they were dispersed within the Gentiles, to my understanding. But here it says, don't go the way of the Gentiles, but go to the lost sheep. I kind of thought they were kind of one and the same to a degree.
Yeah. Well, so the answer for that is actually in Isaiah chapter 9. This is a passage that a lot of us are familiar with. You know, unto us a son is given, unto us a child is born, right? But verse 1 talks about, "Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan in Galilee of the Gentiles." So that right there, gives you this major clue that area was known as the way of the Gentiles, right? And that's what Jesus is getting at. He's not saying that don't go to Gentiles, but don't go along this particular highway, if you will. So he's talking about two physical locations: the way of the Gentiles, and then the city of the Samaritans, right? So that's what he's getting at. Um, you know, but so the lost sheep of the house of Israel, well, you know, where are they? Well, they are in the Gentiles, right? So again, he's not saying don't go to the Gentiles. He's saying don't go to the way of the Gentiles, which was actually a road, right? So don't take this particular highway. That's what he's getting at. And, you know, you have to understand that um, that was in the area of course, Galilee, and Jesus had spent a lot of time in Galilee, right? So he, you know, the vast majority of his ministry was in the area of Galilee, and that's right next door to Mount Hermon. This is where there's an incredible amount of demonic activity that was going on. Why is this so significant? Because this is right next door to the land of Bashan, where Og of Bashan was from. Bashan is actually an Akkadian word, and it means snake dragon. So, you know, and there's even a giant geoglyph right next to the Gilgal Rephaim, a huge geoglyph of this Bashmu, this snake dragon. You can see they're right etched in the earth. If people are curious, you can actually go to Google Earth and put in Gilgal Rephaim. You'll see that. Then zoom out just a little bit, and you'll see this snake etched in the earth. It's huge. It's crazy. So, you know, all of that is giving us this background as to what was going on in that particular area. But nevertheless, this right here is Jesus just saying don't go in this particular direction. But yes, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that is a huge statement. And, you know, it's been rather lost because the way I grew up, what I heard is that Israel, the Jews, they're one and the same thing. And it took me years and years until I finally understood, like, oh, those are two different things. You know, and it was funny because I remember studying about the nation or the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, right? So it's not like I didn't have a academic understanding of those two different things, but I had no theological understanding of those two different things. And I didn't understand how significant it was that they had been split and that they were going to come back together, right? That was the whole point, is he was going to put those two back together. And the only way to do that, because the house of Israel had been divorced. Judah was never divorced. Judah was an adulterous wife, yes, but not divorced. And God only divorced the northern kingdom of Israel. And so to send, to get her back, the only way to truly bring her back into covenant as a corporate entity is for the husband, Jesus, to die, and then he can establish a new marriage contract. I mean, I tell you, when all of these things started falling into place for me, my jaw hit the ground. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is crazy, you know, because it took everything that I knew about God, which wasn't wrong necessarily. It was just quite incomplete. And, you know, so now I have this incredible depth to, you know, understanding this much bigger picture of what Jesus had to do on the cross. Yeah, he died for my sins. Hallelujah. I'm really excited about that. But he did so many other things as well, right there on the cross. And so it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was one thing. I was more or less shown the scriptures as to why we should still be continuing to keep the Torah to the best of our ability, and why it has fulfilled but not abolished, not done away with. And then some of the stuff about why did he have to die on the cross, and how the divorce and all this other stuff is just like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. As you learn more, it's like, oh, now some of these things actually make more sense, where it's just really interesting to me. But moving along here in Matthew 10 now, he's told him to go out and preach, say the kingdom is at hand. But starting in verse 11, it says, whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. Now here's where I highlighted in red here. If the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if it is not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. Whoever does not receive you nor heed your words as you go out of that house or out of the city, shake off your feet. Truly I say to you, it is more tolerable in the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in that day of judgment than for you that city. And to me, that's scary. Those are really harsh words. But I wrote here, it kind of reminds me of the watchman at the wall in Ezekiel.
Mm.
He's telling them, you need to blow the trumpet, you need to sound the alarm, you need to tell people where the sword's coming, or that, hey, maybe we've missed something here. We need to look into this. If they reject you, there's not a lot you can do about that. But if you're refusing, if you're afraid to say something, if you're refusing to say something, then it's, why didn't you warn them? But here, you can try to talk to them, and if they reject you, if they refuse you, it's not your fault. Then the blood's on their own hands, essentially. That's the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah, basically this goes back to hospitality in the ancient Near East, that you were supposed to be hospitable. Remember, there was a man who was traveling with his concubine, and he went to a Benjamite town, and they were not exactly friendly to him, right? They treated him really, really badly. And so that's the idea here, is that you're supposed to go. There are not any Motel 6s. There's not a Holiday Inn. When you go into a city, there should be somebody there, as per the custom, that would take you in and say, "Hey, please come stay with me." Right. So that's the basic idea, that if a place is worthy, right, if they're worthy of actually receiving you, then they will. And of course, if they don't, then that's that. All right. So, I think that just has to do with your basic hospitality in the ancient Near East. But yeah, if they won't receive your words, then shake off the dust from your feet. Again, I think this is a thing where it's like, okay, don't get all bent out of shape. Just shake the dust. The roads are dusty. Just kind of shake it off as you go. Like, okay, that town was not interested. Let's let it go. Now, of course, verse 15 is really where it gets pretty significant, right? That it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city, which is really interesting, because Sodom and Gomorrah had a pretty significant judgment, right? Mm-hmm. But it also gives you kind of the ray of hope for Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, the people there, apparently on Judgment Day, are going to get some break, right? It's not all going to be just bad news. It's going to be maybe some better news to some degree. But yeah, now, and why is Jesus being so incredibly harsh? Well, I would suggest that, Jesus came, he was already a very well-known figure. It was widely known that he was casting out demons, that he was healing the sick. People were hearing this from all over, what he was doing. And, it wasn't just smoke and mirrors. It wasn't like some of your, charlatans today that are just trying to dupe people and to give them money. And you got these sham healings and all this. This is the real deal, right? This is the real deal, right? And so now Jesus is sending out his disciples with the same power, the same exousia is the Greek word there for authority, right? And so they're going in his name, doing the things that he's doing. In fact, when they come back, they're like, we're pretty stoked that even the demons have to listen to us, right? And he's like, don't be too excited about that. Just rejoice that your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, right? So, so these guys came with power. They didn't come just talking, but they came with power. And if people are not willing to receive that, well, then they are closing their eyes to the truth. They're not interested in the truth. They're not interested truly in the coming of the Messiah, as had been massively foretold. And I'll tell you, the messianic expectation in the first century was at a fever pitch, right? There was so much expectation of Messiah, and for good reason, because guess what? He came, and the rabbis figured these things out. I mean, when I read some of the rabbinical writings, I'm like, how did you guys figure this out? That the Messiah should come around the time that Messiah came. I mean, they knew that. They figured it out based on the text. But then when Messiah came, they couldn't see him. I mean, it was just crazy, So, yeah, there's always going to be a certain amount of persecution. There's going to be, if we want to call it persecution, or just people just like not caring. People like, I don't really care what you have to say. I'm not interested. And, I think we have to just learn to say, okay, that's just par for the course. That's the way it is. Look, I'm American. I've never really been persecuted. The closest I ever came to persecution, and this is so small, so small. I was living in Israel. We were having a Bible study at the university, and someone turned the lights off on us. And like, I was like, oh my goodness, someone doesn't like me, you know? And I mean, that was the closest I ever came to a tiny little, itsy bitsy fraction of persecution. And that's nothing, right? Compared to what some people have obviously endured. So, I think as Messianics, it's not always fun when people look at us funny, like we grew two heads or something, and like, what are you doing? Keeping the Torah and all this different stuff. And it's just like, you know what? Look, it's not, I don't have to convince people. I want to just be obedient to what God has told me to do and just live my life, like, and if people want to join me, great. If they don't, well, okay. I mean, that's that, so that's kind of where I've found some peace in this walk.
That's another kind of a thing that I've wondered, and I'm sure a lot of people wonder as well, is obviously you need to try to reach others. You need to talk to others. But if they're not willing to listen, or essentially how far do you really go? Because, I mean, obviously we may not always see the change. We might not be the one. Our job is to plant seeds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we read one person's job to plant seeds, Apollos watered, and then God gives the increase. So, I mean, we also read that no one comes unless the Spirit draws him. Yep. So, I mean, we can plant the seeds, but sometimes people get discouraged, or some people want to put on the full court press, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it is just learning, okay, being subtle, but also not being cowardly, like afraid to speak to people about it as well.
Yeah, well, I also think that there's a sense that, I think some of the so-called, in quotes, persecution that Messianic Torah people sometimes face is brought about by their own behavior and their attitude sometimes, because look, I just, so everybody knows, okay, I teach at the Way congregation. It's a Messianic congregation. We keep Torah. I say that in quotes, okay. And I'll tell you, we've had some people that have come through our doors, and some of them are real jerks, and I don't like them. I'm like, I like the Sunday folks better than you guys, because like they're actually loving, they remind me of Jesus, and you guys remind me of Pharisees, I mean, so, I say that kind of being one of them, right? And here's the attitude that myself included in the Torah community that we can sometimes have is that, well, we're keeping Torah, but people that go to church on Sundays are not keeping Torah. And I think that's really a false dichotomy. And I think we need to really just take that completely out of our vocabulary. And I'm talking about an average zealous Christian, okay? Somebody that's really gung-ho for Jesus. I would dare say that they're keeping Torah, okay? Mm-hmm. And you know what? They might be keeping it better than me. Because what are the most important things of Torah? Is it not eating pork? Is that the most important thing? I don't think so. Keeping the feast, is that the most important thing? I don't think so. Is it tithing your mint, anise, and cumin? No, it's actually, mercy, justice. Those are the things that really, really matter. Now, it's not, you shouldn't leave the others undone, right? Jesus says this very clearly to the scribes and Pharisees, that, you tithe of your mint, anise, and cumin, but you forget the weightier matters of the law. And that's where I think that we have to be very careful. When we come into Torah, I think it's awesome. Look, I'm 100% on board with keeping and honoring and celebrating Shabbat. I'm 100% on board with not eating unclean animals. And I'm 100% on board with keeping the feast, right? But those are the three main things that differentiate us from your average zealous Christian, okay, that goes to church on Sundays and eats pork, right? And this is where we have to have that spirit of humility. They will know we are Christians, or they'll know that we're Christ followers. How? Because we have tzitzit? No. Because we, don't have ham and cheese? No. Right? Those are not the things that will let the world know that we're followers of the Messiah. It's that we love one another, even as he loved us. That is how they're going to know. So if you're looking for what does it really mean to keep Torah, what does that look like? Hey, Jesus is your perfect example. right? He didn't go throwing stones at everybody that wasn't doing it exactly the same way. In fact, he had a tremendous amount of grace and mercy for people that were, a bit ignorant on some things. Who did he have the loudest conversations with? With the Pharisees, right? These are the guys that had it all figured out. They had everything together, and they were supposedly, really keeping Torah better than everybody else. And Jesus had a message for them. No, you're not. You guys have you've gone away from what it actually looks like to keep Torah. So this is where I think, instead of us trying to figure out how am I distinct from my Sunday brothers, let's find a way of how am I similar to my Sunday brothers? Yeah, okay, there's these three things that we see differently. That's true. But, I'm not trying to build a wall between us. I want to build a bridge between us. And I don't have to convince those people that, they're somehow in sin if they're worshiping on Sundays versus on Saturdays. The way I'm going to win them and I'm going to show them is just by doing it, doing it quietly, doing it without any fanfare, not making a big issue of it. If I go out to dinner with somebody and they happen to buy something that's made of pork or shrimp, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. Now, sometimes people have said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, look, it doesn't bother me. You're not hurting me if you decide to eat that. I'm not judging you. I'm not throwing stones at you, right? And I'll tell you what it does is it diffuses the situation. The wall goes down. And guess what? Then they're willing to listen, right? Because I'm not judging them and I'm not attacking them. Then they're actually willing to listen. And then they start to judge my life. Like, oh, you know what? Maybe Doug isn't such a Pharisee. Maybe he actually is kind of Christ-like. He's come to this conviction. I don't share his conviction yet, right? But, I'll tell you, they start to listen and the Holy Spirit starts to do the work. The Holy Spirit starts to convict them on these things so that they can see it as well. And, great, and it takes so much pressure off me. So I don't have to convert people. I mean, I spoke with another Torah guy probably about a year ago, and, he was telling me how he's trying to convert people to Torah. And I'm like, wait, our job is not to convert people to Torah. That's not what we're trying to do, right? I mean, that is not our mission. We're not trying to convert people to Sabbath. We're not trying to convert them to eating clean. We're not trying to convert them to keeping the feast. Those are just great things that I think, we ought to do or not eat, But that's not the mission. The mission is to make disciples who walk in Yeshua's footsteps. Now, part of that process, I would argue that, being like Yeshua is keeping the Sabbath, being like Yeshua is eating clean, and being like Yeshua is keeping the feast. Okay, and so, we can have our little theological debates on those things. But ultimately, I want to bring people to Christ, to make disciples that act like, sound like, look like, talk like Yeshua in every way. And I'm happy to say Jesus too, just to be really clear. So, this is where I really would suggest that those of us who are walking this thing called Torah, that we have a tremendous amount of humility when we do it. God is more than able to do the work. Our job is just to be obedient to him in humility and love for our fellow brothers and sisters who are still worshiping on Sundays and they're still eating pork, right? Let's just love them.
Yeah, the interesting thing is kind of what you described actually kind of described my wife and I, because like I said, 10 years ago, I was introduced to the scriptures on keeping Torah and what's in the Torah and our expectation. Like I said, I went away from that for quite a while, and then my wife started keeping it, and here I am today complaining that maybe people are throwing stones at me, but I was actually throwing stones at her for a little while when she was keeping it. Like
Mm-hmm.
she wouldn't eat like pepperoni pizza or something pork, and I would go after her. I'd say, well, how come you are not eating pork, but you're also not wearing tzitzis? You're not doing this right. And she never tried to push her ways on me. She
Mm-hmm.
just did them quietly. And she
Mm-hmm.
just, whenever I had a question or would attack her, she'd say, I'm still learning.
Mm.
I'm still learning. She did not have to convince me of anything.
Wow.
And just one day she invited me to a fellowship, and the Lord had already been telling me for a while that I need to leave the church that I was currently in, but he never told me where. And I walked
Mm.
in there and he said, here.
Wow.
And that's all it took. It's like all right. And then so I was on board,
Wow.
but she did not have to convince me at all. She lived
Yeah.
the life and she was very humble and said, I'm learning. I'm just trying to learn.
Oh, that's beautiful. Isn't that amazing? You have a
Yeah,
good
it
wife,
is.
man.
Yep.
You better. She's a keeper. Sounds like.
Yep.
Yeah,
But
that's
let's get
awesome.
back to here, just
Yeah.
through some more stuff. I'll just kind of browse through here. Verse 16, it says, Behold, I send you out, sheep in the middle of wolves. Be as shrewd as serpents, but innocent as doves. What does that mean to be shrewd but innocent?
Well, we're not to just leave our brains at home. We're there to use our brains. We're to um, be aware of what's going on. Um, Obviously, serpents have a they have a reputation of being very shrewd. Of course, we think back to the garden. So we're not to be conniving or manipulating people or anything like that, but just be aware. So I train in Krav Maga. It's an Israeli martial art, and we talk about situational awareness all the time. You know, you can't have your defenses up all the time, but you can just be aware of what's going on. And I would suggest that's kind of what Jesus is talking about. Be aware, right? Hey, you're a sheep in the midst of wolves. Okay. So, what do sheep do? Well, they eat grass and, they do sheep stuff. So keep doing the sheep stuff, but just be aware of where you live, right? You're living in the midst of wolves, right? There's usually far more sheep than there are wolves, right? So it's not like you're under attack every single day. But if you're a sheep, you know that their wolves are out there and you want to be aware and just keep your ears open, keep your eyes open, do your stuff, do your life, but just, keep that in mind. So, and he says, beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. You'll be brought before governors and kings for my name's sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. Right. So, again, this wasn't happening every day. They weren't getting scourged every day, and that would not be much of a life. But these will be events that will happen, maybe to the individual, maybe to the community. These will be things that will happen. And so just, be aware, right? Have your eyes open, and your ears open, and your antenna is just kind of, scanning the area and just kind of seeing what's out there.
Yeah, it goes on to say, obviously, you mentioned being brought before councils and everything. And it says, but when they hand you over, do not worry about what to say, for it'll be given to you in that hour what you're to say. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Now, this is where it starts to get, to me, it was a little bit sad.
Mm,
Beware, brother will betray brother
mm,
to
mm-hmm.
death, father his
Yep.
child. Children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. We stop right there. That's just kind of depressing. You will be hated by all men because of my name, and we know somebody else that was too. But
Mm,
it is the one who endures to the end who will be saved. And not everybody's like this. Not everybody like this. The church that we left, there's people that they're very hurt. They literally, we've had people stop at our door saying that they're praying for us, and they essentially think that we're lost just because we stopped going to their church and we're now
mm,
keeping Shabbat. And it's like, I appreciate your heart. I appreciate that you're reaching out, and I appreciate that you care.
mm,
I do not believe I'm lost at all. I'm just
mm-hmm.
not in the same fellowship as you are, so to speak. But then again, I also have some people within my own family, even that, like, I've got dirty text messages or dirty Facebook responses that
Mm,
that we're trying to become Jewish, or we're on our way to hell now and we're following a cult, and we've gotten
yeah.
these emails, and just like, and I can think of a couple people specifically. It's like, and I've invited, and I'm like, won't you come over to my house with your Bible? I appreciate your concern. Let's just open it up and let's just go through this together. I know what my Bible says, and I mean, they're just, some are quite harsh about it. Not all of them
Yeah.
are. Some are
Right.
harsh though.
Yeah.
It's sad.
Yeah. And, I don't know if there's any silver bullet to make them see. I've been accused of, going straight to hell because I'm telling people to keep the Sabbath and all this different stuff. And, I think this, and so, obviously you can't reach everybody. You can't communicate that message to everybody. Some people will just not listen. But, I've also had people over the years, they're like, in fact, somebody just reached out to me and they're like, 13 years ago when I was your student, you were talking about bodies of light, and I thought you were crazy, And then he's like, I just came across something in the church fathers, and it's talking about bodies of light, and he's like, that's so cool, and thanks, and just letting you know. I was like, well, that's cool, Took him 13 years to figure out that I wasn't crazy way back then, and this is where I think our response to people that think we've joined a cult or something, we've just got to be very careful how we respond. Just respond in love, and say, man, thank you, brother, and give them the opportunity to come and say, why don't you come over, show me where I've gone wrong, and because all I want, the only thing I want, is the truth. That's the only thing I want is truth, nothing else. It doesn't really matter what the truth is, if the moon is made of cheese, okay, if that's what the truth is, then who am I to argue with it, right? I just want to have my life conform to reality. That's what truth is reality, so please, invite them, give them an opportunity to come and pitch to you why what you're doing is so wrong. And of course, in the course of doing that, then, you're going to be armed with what and say, well, brother, help me understand, what did Jesus mean here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, when he said that he didn't come to do away with the law, and that anybody who speaks against the law is going to be the least in the kingdom. Like, I mean, how am I supposed to interpret that? Because I don't want to be the least. I want to be a great person in the kingdom. And it says right here from the words of our Lord, that I'm supposed to keep the commandments. On another occasion, as you're having this conversation, a lawyer came to Jesus and said, good teacher, what must I do to, what good work must I do to inherit the kingdom of God? And he said, well, keep the commandments, right? And, if you keep the commandments, you'll inherit eternal life, right? So, like, if I just take Jesus at his word, it seems that there's something good about keeping Torah. When I read Paul, right, do we, does somehow, our faith invalidate Torah? I mean, he says in Romans 3:31, do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. I mean, there's so many passages. So, help me to understand how to interpret these things, and so sometimes by just taking that humble position, not telling them what to think, but having them tell you what to think in light of these particular verses, then you can have a conversation. So years ago, we had a guy that was on staff at our church, and his brother is a Calvary Chapel pastor. And I had spoken at his church years ago on the topic of the Nephilim, and he loved me back then. Okay, so he called me up. He's like, "Hey, my brother is working for your church, and he thinks that you got to keep the law to be saved." I was like, "No, I don't think your brother thinks that. In fact, we do not teach that. We don't teach that you have to keep the law to be saved. We believe that we are saved by God's incredible goodness and grace. We simply want to be obedient to what the Lord has said." Because we think there's a blessing in that, but we're not in any way, in any shape, or size or form, are we trying to do the law so that somehow God has to let us in. We're not that dumb, okay? Trust me. I am banking on God's mercy and His grace. That is what I will be claiming when I stand before the Lord. Hey, I'm here by the blood of Christ, man. I am here by your goodness and your grace and your mercy, not by my own merits, Lord. Oh no, I am not here by my own merits. I'm not so foolish, right? But then again, because He saved me, because He loves me, I simply want to be obedient, and I guarantee you, every zealous Christian, I don't mean the guys that are CEOs, right? Christmas, Easter only. I mean, the ones that actually, go to church, they're serious about Jesus. They believe the same thing that we believe. They just use different terminology. And I think part of our challenge is a matter of nomenclature. It's a matter of vocabulary, that we just have to translate what we're saying. Because when we start using this word Torah, oh, this big red flag goes up in their mind. They're like, oh my gosh, he's turning Jewish or something. But of course, that's not what we're saying. All we're saying is, I discovered there's 3 other things that I think I should be doing. That's all we're doing, and so by using the word Torah, we make this wall go up in their minds, and they think that we've lost our minds. Of course we haven't. We're just like, I discovered 3 more things that I think the Lord might want me to do, and I want to be obedient to those, right? Now, those 3 things are kind of biggies for some Sunday Christians. They think that if you do those things, that somehow you've lost you've lost your way, and you're putting yourself under the law, and you're going to fall from grace. I mean, it's all just such nonsense. But again, if you can find common ground with them, instead of trying to figure out how, I'm different, and and all this other stuff. I mean, just find the common ground and say, well, listen, we both agree that we shouldn't murder, right? I mean, that's a commandment, yes. Yeah, well, that was repeated in the New Testament. Well, okay. Jesus did keep the Sabbath. Would you agree with me on that? Yeah, but that was before the cross. Like, okay, well, tell me where God says that after the cross, I'm not supposed to keep the Sabbath anymore. Like, is there a commandment that says that? God said he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it even says that in the new covenant, Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31, and Hebrews chapter 8, they both talk about that in the new covenant, what is he going to put in my heart, right? What's he going to put in my heart? His Torah, right? His law, his instructions, so that's part of it. And the other thing that a lot of people don't understand is because they conflate the covenant with the instructions, and they're 2 different things, 2 completely different things altogether, right? So the covenant, the old covenant, that was established at Mount Sinai, the Sinaitic covenant, that was a marriage contract, and were God's instructions part of that? Of course, right? But the instructions are different than the contract. Now, the new contract, the new marriage covenant, also has Torah in it, the same Torah, mind you, but it's a different contract. And because people conflate those 2, they think that the contract and the instructions are one and the same thing. Then when you say that the old covenant has been done away with, and I agree, it has been done away with, then you start thinking, well, therefore the law has been done away with. But of course, that's not the case. The law, or God's instructions, are ever present. I mean, it's really insane to think that you could ever do away with God's laws. I mean, come on, I mean, can you do away with the law of electricity? No. You can learn how to use it. Can you do away with the law of gravity? No, but you can learn how to operate within its confines and thrive. And so God's laws are the very laws of the universe. We understand these things when it comes to physical laws, natural laws. We understand that electricity is the way it is. It has no respecter of persons. It doesn't care who you are. You could be mom of the year, dad of the year, employee of the year. And if you misuse electricity, if you grab it by an open wire, it'll kill you. It doesn't matter how nice you are and how sweet you are. It'll kill you in an instant. But if you use it properly, man, it'll heat your home, it'll entertain you, it'll pop your popcorn, it'll do everything for you. Electricity is awesome, but you have to fear electricity. You've got to respect its power, and you have to know how to use it properly, or it will kill you. And the same thing is true with any of God's laws, whether they are physical laws or they are, let's call them moral laws. If you violate these things, you'll be in trouble. All right. I mean, nobody is so foolish to think that you can just start murdering and there won't be any consequence. There will be a consequence. There's always a consequence to these things. And, we have our police that generally take care of these things. But that's because we all demand that our police go and find the perpetrator who took this life. Right. And I tell you, when you lose somebody, you suddenly want justice. Okay, you want justice to be done. But it's when I commit a crime that, well, it's not so bad, right? When I commit a sin, like, it's not such a big deal. But when someone commits it against me, well, now that's a whole different ballgame, right? And so if you can help people understand, because what's happened, sadly, is that, and I did a video on this called Haunted Theology, and I talk about how our theology has been haunted by this guy named Marcion. He was a 2nd century heretic. He was rabidly anti-Sabbath, anti-Torah, anti-Jewish. He came up with this idea that the God of the Old Testament was this demiurge, this people's God, and he somehow foisted the Torah, the law, on the backs of Jews, and it would only be removed when Jesus graciously came, sent by the true Creator God, sent Jesus to take away that burden of the Torah, the burden of the law. That is the haunting of our theology, and nobody, of course, knows it, right? You can't see that a house is haunted just by looking at it. You have to go in, experience, you're like, something's not right here. Something is off in this house. And that's what's happened to our theology. And I'll tell you, I've heard that sermon so many times. It's crazy. I've heard this. I was part of Calvary Chapel for a long time. I used to be a Baptist. And I heard that same general Marcionistic interpretation of the law, how Paul was the only guy that got it right. I mean, these are all things coming straight from Marcion. So what a lot of people don't understand who are in the Sunday expression of faith, they get a lot right, but what they don't understand is that one of the things that they're actually doing is they're following the tenets of Marcion. And so they have this really twisted view of the Torah, which is ironic because on any given day, most of them are going to keep 99.9% of the things found in the Torah. It's only those 3 things, which is Sabbath, what you can eat, and the feast. Those are the 3 basic things that they're not really doing. But otherwise, they're very law-abiding. They believe in God's laws. They want to be Christ-like. They want to be godly in their lives. And so there's this philosophical disconnect when it comes to the law, but there's most of the time there's a very practical keeping of the law in a general respect.
All right, now I'm gonna go down a little bit because I know you don't have a lot of time left, but there's one more thing I want to see if maybe you could touch on just a little bit. Going down to verse 32. Therefore, everyone who confesses me before men, I will confess him before my Father who's in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will deny also before my Father who's in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth, but I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. What I think of when I hear this, he's not saying don't love your wife. He's not saying don't love your family members or anything like that. But basically, what's more important to you? Me or them? And I think of, which we use this analogy a lot, Abraham and Isaac. I mean, God wanted to see, is he willing to give up his one son that he didn't think he would ever have, and I gave him for me, to listen to me. And we all know how that ended up. But here, would you say this is kind of like an example of what's more important to you? I mean, I'm not trying to set you apart. I would love it that everybody was all on the same page, but there's going to be times where your wife, your spouse, your mother-in-law, whoever may be against you. Who are you going to choose now?
Yeah, absolutely. This is really a comparison issue versus a absolute. I mean, yeah, obviously God is not saying to hate your mother and father and have nothing to do with them. I mean, hate your son and daughter. I mean, we have so many clear teachings that you're to love your children. Paul talks about this in the book of Ephesians. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church, right? So obviously all those things are in there. But when it comes to this question, okay, who's more important? Will I listen to my wife over Jesus, or will I first take into consideration what Jesus says, and then listen to my wife in light of what God has told me to do, right? And so it's definitely a comparison. It's definitely a comparison. And I mean, this is something that every believer has to come to grips with, and I had to do the same thing. It was not easy to leave a church that I had been very well established in. I was liked. I was reputed with, they liked my teachings. They liked my end time stuff. And, I knew that it would cost me when I when I stopped being part of Calvary Chapel, and when I started keeping the Sabbath, and and I remember I was at a party, I think it was a Easter get together. My former boss, like every Easter, he would have us over, and he, ironically, he would bake an Easter ham, and I, this is like the last time I went over there, but I got the invitation. I'm like, yeah, I want to go, but I'm not going to eat the pork, like I just don't want that. So I went over there, and I was trying to not make an issue of it, right? I was just trying to quietly eat something else, right? I wasn't going saying, oh, you guys are all going to hell. Like, I wasn't doing that, I was just trying to quietly not eat the ham. But it was weird because he's like, oh, why don't you want ham? And I was like, well, I've just changed my diet. Oh, well, why did you do that? Like, there's all this suspicion that, here I was not trying to make a big deal of it and trying to be quiet about this, but by my refusal, my quiet refusal, I might hasten to add, I was just trying to leave it off my plate. And he's like, well, don't you want some? I'm like, well, man, I don't really want any. And, and so they started seeing like, well, what's going on with Doug, and, so I did that. And then I started keeping the Sabbath. But again, I wasn't throwing stones at Sunday people. I wasn't throwing stones at people that don't keep the feast. But people start to notice, and then they're like, well, what happened to him? And I just thought, you know what? I've got to decide. I have to decide, how I'm going to do this. And, I even had a family member challenge me on some of these things. And I was really surprised by her response, that there was a suggestion that somehow the Torah was equivalent to the Sharia law. Like, that really struck me. I'm just like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no correlation whatsoever, but this is what's been ingrained in people for roughly 2,000 years, this attitude that God's Torah, God's instructions, which are what? God's values. They're God's values. And that somehow these are bad, evil, outdated, oppressive. I'm just like, where did we get this idea that God's values are bad? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, if you take a kind of a more extreme example, let's say you have someone who's in a gang, and they beat up people on a regular basis. They do drugs, they might do some petty theft here and there. And then they start coming to Christ. They're like, wait, I shouldn't be doing these things. And then their drug family, their gang family's like, what's wrong with you? You're going to choose us? You're going to choose Christ? Well, I'm going to choose Christ, obviously, right? So it's easy to see it when it's in that kind of situation. But when it's when people close to us, people that we really care about, that we grew up with, that we're committed to, that we've pledged our lives to protect them and keep them, and then they start to question, well, then it's a very different thing, And so, again, yeah, Jesus isn't saying to not love these people, but you got to choose who is going to be king in your life. Who is your Lord? Is it Jesus, or is it your desire to be received and welcomed by these other people? And so as you take a step, as you are a pioneer, some people will follow, some people will not. And that's the reality. And a real pioneer isn't looking behind him. A real pioneer is not so concerned about who's following. He's just blazing the trail. And if people decide to follow, great. If they don't, well, that's too bad. It'd be nice if some people came, but that's not the point. You've got to be willing to launch out, go the right way, and eventually people will follow. But again, as you're going along and you're blazing the trail, just be nice not to throw stones at other people, that aren't on the path. Like, what's wrong with you? You're such a terrible person. And I get this from people for all the time. They're like, well, don't you think that Sunday people are all just pagans? I'm like, no, I don't. I really don't. I really, really don't think that they're all pagans. I think it's a mistake that they eat pork. I think it's a mistake that they don't keep the Sabbath. And I think it's a shame that they don't enjoy the feast, but I don't think they're pagans. I think that they're Christians who love Jesus, but have grown up in some of these traditions where they just don't understand. And I want God to do the work, not me. And it's so much nicer and so much easier when I just let him do the work and I just keep following him. And if people follow me, great. If they don't, well, okay, that's life.
All right. Well, I know you got to go. So once again, I just want to thank you for coming on and going through these questions. Because like I said, some of this stuff can be discouraging when you're new to this thing. But I just wanted to, that's the whole point of my channel, is I want to ask the questions and learn from people that know more than me even, and help. Iron sharpens iron, and we can all learn together on how to handle these situations and continue to love them, continue to pray for them, even though we may not always be in agreement with them. But
amen.
Once again, I want to thank you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, but you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.